Because I'm a stud. I'm ballsy. I don't take no shit from anyone. I smoke my stogie
with ash holes.
I don't have to find a hideout place like you.
Welcome to the Johnny Mandolin Show. Guess what? It's Artie the Cigar Guy. I'm back for another episode. And today we're going to be talking to my good friend Robert Twosto concerning the history and kind of a little bit about the timeline of tobacco and cigars. So please stay tuned here on City World Radio. Folks, to City World Radio. So, like I said before, today we're going to be talking a little bit about the history and the timeline of tobacco in the Americas and then across the rest of the world. But before we jump into that, I just want to say thank you so much for coming, Robert. Robert's a good friend of mine. Why don't you introduce yourself real quick?
Artem, thank you very much for your very kind invitation. I'm happy to be here. My name is Robert Twosto, and I am a cigar enthusiast just as you are and so many people in your audience.
Yes. So, Rob, can you tell a little bit about how we know each other?
Yeah, we met at the East 73rd Street Casa de Monte Cristo Cigar Lounge, which is there are two of them, obviously. There's one on East 54th, I think it is.
Yeah, 2nd Ave. That's right.
2nd Ave, and the other one on East 73rd Street. And we bonded over our mutual love of cigars.
That's right. So actually, me and Rob are part of this little clique called the River Boys, where every about Sunday night we go over to the East River and we smoke cigars. So that's how we kind of got to know each other. So let's jump.
Shout out to the River Boys.
Shout out to
I know they're
Boys.
listening.
Yeah, they definitely are.
God bless them.
So, real quickly, guys, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of how today's going to go, okay? So there's several parts of the tobacco history that I want to go over. There's obviously the pre-Columbian history. Then we're going to have post-Columbian history in the Europe as well as the United States. And then we're going to delve a little bit into, like, the mid-1950s to modern day, pretty much discussing about cigar laws and how it's actually affecting our lives and all that stuff, okay? So, like I said, I think the best place to start is pre-Columbian history. And Robert, do you know anything about this time era when it comes to tobacco? Because I actually had to research most of this stuff. I didn't know any of it.
Well, it's interesting because tobacco is growing naturally in the Americas probably as early as 6000 BC. That's a long time ago. And it's a plant that is being used medicinally. People think it has medicinal purposes. Mm-hmm. It's also a plant that is very popular amongst the various indigenous peoples one found in North and South America. Mm-hmm. And it was thought to be a cure-all, something people use to dress wounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually quite interesting. What I wasn't aware of is that they took it in many different ways. So they would smoke it. Funny enough, it wasn't called smoking. Back then, there wasn't really a word for smoking, so they would call it drinking the tobacco leaf. And then they would sniff it, and they would obviously chew it, smoke it, and also create it into a tea. So they were actually taking it every single way. And I read that chewing it was actually a way to get rid of toothaches, which sounds a little bit contradictory, but that's what it said. I would expect that to be the coca leaf, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
But apparently tobacco is also a painkiller. That's very interesting. One thing I do want to point out, and this always was very interesting to me, so the Mayan word cigar is actually where the word cigar came from. There's also a company called Zycar, which produces all different types of cutters, lighters, all that. So they actually got their name from the word cigar. And sic is actually the Taino word for tobacco. So that's where it comes from. The cigar, the R part means to smoke rolled tobacco. And I always thought that was really, really interesting. Another thing, I don't know if you know this, but back then, pre-Columbian, like way back in the day, and they did adopt this a little bit later on in the 1600s as well, but they didn't actually roll the tobacco up in other tobacco leaves. They would actually use things like plantain leaves and, palm leaves and all that. So it's weird. I wonder if that's something that we could bring back. Would you try that, Rob?
Well, you have to give credit to the primitive peoples. I use the word primitive in quotes, who were so ingenious. And one wonders if, in fact, that's the sort of thing that might be, I don't know, people would be trying in this day and age.
Yeah, that's something quite interesting. So the only real kind of like, they found different artwork from around like the 10th century, but that's way forward, depicting people smoking. The only real credible thing I was able to find was this interesting Native American myth, which talks about a shaman, right? His people were suffering through a really great drought. So what he did is he took the tobacco and he rolled it up in a tube and he started smoking it. And what he did is he created mighty clouds that went all the way up to the sky and actually produced rain and, quenched his people's thirst. And that's really the first reference you see to tobacco in actually like Native American mythology. And I found that really fascinating, that it was so popular that it was actually, in their ethos. You know what I mean?
Right.
They did use it in religious ceremonies a lot, as you mentioned, also medicinal ceremonies, and I mean that's pretty much it. There's not really much going on. We know it was there. It's in the same family as like nightshade and potatoes, and we knew that it grew really frequently and that people used it, but there's no really record keeping during that time. So for me personally, the time that really shows you how far tobacco has come is with Columbus. Right. So as soon as he landed, that's when it all started going. So now we're pretty much done with the pre-Columbian. We're going to move forward into the post-Columbian era. That's between 1492 and 1610. Okay.
Right. So imagine we can go back in time. Imagine we have a time machine and we can go back to the island of Hispaniola circa 1492. And we see Columbus come off his boat with his crew in the back, and we see him being greeted by Native Americans, indigenous peoples, however one wants to describe them, and they come bearing gifts. They're not at all angry at him or, violent. They come bearing gifts, and one of those tokens that they carry is, in fact, tobacco. So Columbus and his crew, they see this substance, they see it being smoked in pipes, they see it being rolled up and smoked. I could only imagine what it is, what they were thinking, this marvelous new thing.
Well, that's funny that you mentioned that, because I have actually a quote here. This is exactly from Christopher Columbus's journal, written on October 12th, 1492. And it goes as follows. The natives bought fruit, wooden spears, and certain dried leaves which gave off a distinct fragrance. Now, here's what's really interesting about that, Robert, that they actually took the tobacco and they threw it out. They actually didn't know what to do with it, and they thought that it was like almost like a narcotic. They even though that was the big thing, but to them it was new, and they were actually scared of it. So they threw it out. But then this is the coolest thing for me, right? This is the coolest thing I think that I've learned doing research about this episode that we're doing today, and that is the simple fact that we can literally trace patient zero. We could find the first European, we know his name, that actually started smoking and got addicted to tobacco. Let me explain. So pretty much there was a crewman called Rodrigo de Jerez, and pretty much he was in, Hispaniola. He was on the island of Cuba. He saw these natives, like I said, drinking the smoke, and he started doing it out of a pipe. And he would smoke the hell out of that pipe all the way back to Spain. Now, this is the kicker. When he got back to Spain, right, he actually got imprisoned by the Inquisition because they said that the only but the only thing that would expel smoke out of their nostrils and mouth is the devil.
Of course.
So they thought that he was possessed, and they actually, like I said, they actually locked him up. He was released 7 years later, and the funny thing about it is when he came out, everybody was smoking tobacco by then. You know what I mean? So, and that really is interesting to me that we know who the first guy is. We know who got the slap on the wrist first, and that's fascinating because, like I said, that's why when I said that post-Columbian, we get a lot more in-depth and we get a lot more interesting information.
Right.
That's why, because people started writing this shit down.
The historical record
Exactly.
is better.
Exactly. So, the cultivation of tobacco started off pretty fast. It definitely ramped up around the 30s. So about 50 years later is when it went from pretty much just going over to the Americas to just trade for tobacco to actually setting up farms and land and all that good stuff. So obviously this was all led by the Spanish.
Right.
And that started in 1531 on the island of Santo Domingo. You know where that is, Rob?
That is modern-day Dominican Republic.
My man. Okay, yes. And then, but that was just the cultivation of tobacco, okay? The interesting thing is that, that's...
I think that's a call from Santo Domingo.
That's a door. Okay, so then in about 10 years later, in 1542, that is when they started actually having the first cigar factories. Right, so 1530s cultivation became a big thing. 1540s we're actually rolling the things up in Cuba. You know what I mean? So the first cigar factories were actually based out of Cuba.
Now that would make sense because, as you always like to say, you've said it to me, you say it to everyone else. When it comes to the fundamental starting point about appreciating a cigar, it's the 3 S's: sun, seed, soil. And one can only assume that Cuba has historically and traditionally always been at the forefront in that regard with respect to those three things.
You're absolutely right. But here's something that I also picked up on when I was researching this, and we're going to get into this way more in depth a little bit later. But Florida, it's very close to Cuba.
Right.
And they're pretty much very similar. So Florida actually also produces some really, really fine Cuban-esque tobacco. At certain points in Cuba's history, they would actually import Florida tobacco just because they weren't able to produce enough. You know what I mean? They weren't producing enough tobacco for the rollers to pump out into cigars. So Florida had to take over, and then after a while, Florida actually became its own business, and they were just absolutely killing it.
Right.
So you were telling me about the Spanish doctor, Nicholas. Remember, you mentioned something about that?
Yeah, there was a Spanish doctor. I believe the gentleman's name was Nicolas Monardes.
That's it.
And he wrote a book about the history of medicinal plants in the New World. This is roughly around, in the 1570s. And he claimed that tobacco, as one of those plants, could cure 36 separate health problems.
36?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't understand. Okay, so we know tooth pain. What else? Headaches? I know that there was... what they did is so I mentioned before that they used to snort tobacco, and apparently that cured migraines. I was very surprised by that, you know what I mean? But it kind of makes sense. I mean, sometimes when I have a headache and I'm smoking, it gets worse. Maybe I should start crushing up the cigar and snorting some, make this headache go away. I never thought of that.
Well, let's stay away from snorting tobacco.
No, okay, just really quickly, I do not condone anybody snorting tobacco. Don't do that.
Absolutely.
But hey, actually, a little jump forward. Did you know that there's actually special nicotine, powders that you can, it's like tobacco powder that is actually meant for snorting. That's actually a real thing.
I did not know that.
Yeah. We used to sell it about 10 years ago when I used to work in the head shop in my old neighborhood of Bensonhurst. We would have it. It was different flavors: mint, raspberry, strawberry, and you could literally put a little line and just snort it, and it would give you a nicotine rush. And it was actually tobacco that was super duper dried and just powdered. And I always found it very, very, very fascinating. But I think they made it illegal after a while just because it kind of promoted, other drug use. So it kind of makes sense. But it was a thing for like a couple of years. Fascinating.
All right.
I guess that was a throwback. So another thing, so I was very much aware of South America, North America, in some parts of Europe they were also growing tobacco. But here's what I didn't know about the Philippines. Did you know about this?
I vaguely. Go ahead.
Yeah, so pretty much in around the 1590s, 1600s, they actually bought a ton of tobacco seeds to the Philippines. Now, I wanna give you a little perspective here. 1 ounce of tobacco seed has 300,000 seeds. 1 ounce. Tobacco seeds are extremely, extremely small, and they bought 110 pounds back. Let me do a little quick math. No, I'm not going to do that. I suck at math. Anyway, a whole ton of seeds. So they bought maybe they could have probably covered the whole island of the Philippines, the many, many islands of the Philippines,
yeah.
all over in tobacco. And so supposedly the Philippines had actually those 3 S's that you mentioned.
Sun, seed, soil.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's I didn't know about this. I personally never tried Filipino tobacco. I wonder if there's actually a market for it now, if there's any cigars that include it. But apparently back in the day it was really, really big deal. And what made it perfect, since Spain was pretty much the one that was running everything back in the day as far as tobacco, they owned the Philippines. So for them it was like, hey, look, we're gonna pretty much use our resources to fund the operation. Funny enough, around this time they also tried to make a ban in South America with tobacco as far as cultivating it, so they can kind of corner the market. You know what I mean? Since they owned the properties, they didn't allow anybody else to grow tobacco there, and instead they grew it in the Philippines. That backfired on them, because even though the Filipino tobacco was apparently nice, it wasn't as good as the South American tobacco. So what they had to do is they pretty much reopened the operations over in Cuba, and I found that really, really, really interesting.
Can't top that climate, that soil, and the seeds. Just can't top it.
So really quickly, even though it seems like tobacco's taken over the world. Everyone's loving it. They're just, everyone's consuming like crazy. You were mentioning to me that there's people that were denouncing it. Like, we did talk about the Inquisition that locked up the first smoker that was brought in, right? But you were telling me that there was like some talk to me about the punishments that people would get. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Well, there were some rulers like King Philip II of Spain, there's Spain again, and King James I of England, who were denouncing smoking as being evil. So they didn't understand. It's only natural sometimes for people to fear what they don't understand.
That sounds more of like a religious thing than anything, right?
Yeah, but the Catholic Church sanctioned the execution of 5 friars who happened to be smoking during a service. Can you imagine? 5 men.
Yeah. So that's quite fascinating to me. That I think that might go back to the whole Inquisition thing, right? That maybe since it was a substance and all substance abuse was considered like a sin, they probably put tobacco in that same category, even though it doesn't really give you much of a high or anything.
Or the flip side of the coin being, it would be considered blasphemous to do something during a church service like that, and so as a result, maybe that was considered by the standards of the day as proof of being inhabited by the devil. Therefore,
yeah, exactly.
A penalty had to come about.
Yeah. And so we talked a lot about Europe, but I also know that for instance, in the Middle East, tobacco also became very popular, and some, not I wouldn't say everybody in the Middle East was against it, but there were some kings and sultans that were not happy with it, and obviously if you smoked, bam, they chopped off your arm. You know what I mean? That was how bad it got sometimes. So the thing that I find the most interesting, and this is sort of to me a little bit like similar to what's going on here in the United States with marijuana, is that in 1635, right, Louis XIII, France, he pretty much made it you're allowed to smoke tobacco, right, but only if it's prescribed by your doctor. Right? Doesn't that sound like medicinal marijuana here in the USA? Like, you can smoke, but only if it's prescribed by your doctor,
Right. Which we have in New York, or which we've had for several years in New York, medicinal marijuana. And who knows, maybe shortly it might be legalized by the legislature, probably maybe in the next year.
Yeah. And it's funny how it's like circular, right? Like, people were going through this shit back in the day. I wouldn't be surprised if there was, people in France like, oh, legalize tobacco, okay. I want to just apologize to all my French listeners. That was kind of messed up.
Listen, it's almost 4:20, so you're perfectly entitled.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I didn't even realize that. So, I mean, pretty much that's the general gist of tobacco. You know, in the going into the New World and coming back to Spain and Europe. There's obviously a lot more to talk about. It's spread all over. It went to the Middle East, Africa, Asia, but you know, the story mainly focuses, in my opinion, on Europe, because Europe is the one that got it going. They got the first dibs, and they're the ones that really turned it into a huge thing. Obviously, you know, tobacco moved to India. It was very, very popular over there, if I'm not mistaken. Asia as well. Even nowadays, I think China has like the most highest smoking population out of any country, you know, don't quote me on that. That might be somewhere in Africa. I'm not sure. But anyway, they do smoke way more than you know, here in the U.S. In the U.S., actually, tobacco use has dropped, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Cigarette use.
Yes.
I think cigar use has actually increased, if I'm not mistaken.
Probably.
Hallelujah, right?
Yes.
So, this is something that I think you know about a little bit more. So now I want to focus on post-Columbian history of tobacco, but more on the USA. And you were telling me a couple things earlier when we were discussing this episode that I want you to kind of go into again, like about the whole Britain and Massachusetts, whatever. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean, here we are. We're in the 17th century. We're deep in the heart of the 1600s, and tobacco was being planted at enormous levels, so much so that in Virginia, the settlers there were growing so much tobacco that they were neglecting their own food crops, if you can imagine that.
So I'm guessing the tobacco made more money.
Absolutely.
So people, that's funny. People were literally smoking themselves to death to starvation.
Willing to starve for
But
tobacco.
that's pretty wild.
Yeah. But, of course, this is because that tobacco was being harvested and then sent back to England and then through the rest of Europe, and it was enormously profitable. In fact, by about 1640, if you can believe it, they are exporting 1.5 million pounds of tobacco to England.
How crazy is that?
1.5 million pounds.
I you know, I can't even really picture that. How much? Like, because okay, nowadays, modern times, right? We want to transport 1.5 million pounds. It doesn't seem too crazy, right? But back then, with those rickety old boats, you know what I mean? It's an unbelievable amount of work and effort. Now we have machines doing all this. It just seems like such an achievement, and it shows just how like much of a grip this leaf has on our culture and our society.
It's almost like a mania.
Yeah. Like a lot of huge changes and a lot of big things opened up just because of this one plant. You know, it's kind of not taken for granted because it's a bit demonized nowadays, right? But it did actually build up the whole structure of this society we live in. And just to point out just how amazingly influential it was. So I don't know if you guys know this, but during the Revolutionary War, obviously when America was trying to break away from Britain, tobacco was one of the hugest bargaining chips that they had as far as getting finances from France. They pretty much said, France, you know, we need help militarily, we need training, we need supplies. France was like, oh, what do you have? And then the Americans were like, we got a ton of tobacco. And they're like, okay, we're good. Oh, I gotta stop doing this accent, man. I'm so sorry again. Anyway, so it pretty much was the impetus. You know, people say it's tea, right? But there's no way that France was going to give us soldiers. Excuse me, not soldiers, but training, supplies, all the other good stuff for tea. They had plenty of tea, but the tobacco is what really gave us the opportunity to break away. So think about this: if there was no tobacco,
there would be no United States of America.
It's wild. It's wild. So next time you complain about me smoking a cigar on the street, think about that, Republicans. I'm sorry, I love Republicans. I'm just kidding. Here's another interesting thing. Another huge thing that kind of got the Revolutionary War going is that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, all the big guys, you know what I mean? They all had tobacco farms. And the reason that they were pissed, obviously, was taxation. Britain had such a great taxation on tobacco that they were in debt to Britain. So I'm not saying that the Founding Fathers were like tax dodgers, but that's pretty much what they were. They were like, this is ridiculous. I'm broke as hell because of you, Britain. I'm just trying to grow some tobacco and make some money, and you're making it very difficult. So, shoo, get out of here.
Time for a revolution.
Yeah, exactly. And it's always tea, isn't it? When they taught us in school, it's
Correct.
tea. They dumped the tea. A bunch of guys dumped some tea into a harbor, and that's
Correct.
what set it off. But then in the background, tobacco is like actually making all the big moves.
Tobacco,
You know what I mean?
Tobacco was the silent hero of the Revolutionary War.
I don't have these numbers, but do you think they imported more tea? Or wait, tea's not from the Americas, is it?
I thought it was from India.
Asia, right? Yeah. Okay, never mind. Now I'm just going off on a tangent. Sorry. So yeah, that's that's always very fascinating. And for some reason, tobacco and war seem to be really, really connected. It seems that all the big important moves that come with tobacco seem to be centered around war. And let me explain why. So the next thing I want to talk about is the 7 Years' War. Now, to be honest, before I started researching this episode, I don't know anything about the 7 Years' War. Do you know anything about this?
I think it lasted 7 years.
Oh, bravo. Yeah, so, but what we do know is that there was a gentleman, Israel Putnam, right? And he bought a bunch of seeds from Havana back to the U.S., okay? And he started growing these seeds in the Hartford area of New England. And this is what's really cool. Because, so let me put it into perspective. Because of the war, right, this guy left, bought the Cuban seeds to Connecticut. All right, you guys see where I'm going with this. Next step, grows them in Connecticut. Boom, 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 boom. Several years later, Connecticut broadleaf. So, what am I getting at? All you guys who love your Liga Privadas, all you guys who love your Tabernacles, all you guys who love that fantastic Connecticut broadleaf that everyone always raves about, we need to thank this one guy, and we need to thank the 7 Years' War, apparently, for getting him to take these seeds, bring them to America, and grow them there, and that's why we have the Connecticut broadleaf. So again, war equals innovation in tobacco. You know what I mean? It's really weird how the two are connected.
Yeah, and it's almost like tobacco facilitates war, which facilitates greater tobacco distribution and appreciation.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like we're talking about oil or something, right?
Yeah.
It's crazy.
It's a commodity, same way.
Yeah. So now this is something that I found very interesting. I probably said that 100 times today, but did you know how big the industry was here in New York back in the 1800s and such? Did you know about any of this?
Well, I know that at the turn of the last century, let's say we go through the entire 19th century, we're at the year 1900.
Mm-hmm.
That I don't know if you could guess, but at that time, 3.5 billion with a B cigarettes are sold. Can you take a guess how many cigars were sold at that time?
Well, Billy, I don't know. No, that's too much.
6 billion.
Wait, so are you saying that there was more cigars than cigarettes being sold?
Yeah, circa 1900, we're talking about
Wow.
3.5 billion cigarettes and about 6 billion cigars. Can you imagine? And keep in mind, this is also with, at that point, we'll get to that later in the 20s, but at that point, women, for the most part, were not a market for cigars or cigarettes because it was considered unfeminine or declassé. But just with men smoking, 6 billion cigars in 1900.
Well, here's the thing. That didn't last for long, I'm guessing, because what I found what I found fascinating, to be honest, is that during World War I, that's when cigarette smoke really took off.
Correct.
Generals were saying that the rations needed to include tobacco as well as food and medical supplies, because if they didn't, the men would get antsy or whatever it is, and they actually approved that, and that's when you had the provisions with the tobacco, and that's fascinating. So that's pretty much, I guess you could say, that's the kind of like turning point, right? That's when it went from cigars were more popular to cigarettes, and then I guess around World War I, it's when it kind of flopped. And funny enough, around 1902 is when Marlboro was actually. It was in Marlboro. 1 second.
Was it Reynolds or?
Philip Morris. That's
Philip
what it was.
Morris.
So that's when Philip Morris started selling cigarettes in 1847, and then they opened up their first HQ, you could say, in New York City in around the early 1900s. So that's when I think it really took off. But again, here's what I didn't know. I didn't know that for a while, New York, and we're talking about like mid 1800s to the 1810s, 1820s, was actually a really, really, really huge manufacturer of cigars. Did you know about this?
Yes, I did. As it turns out, when you're talking about in the post-Civil War era, let's say in the 1880s, cigars are being manufactured in apartment houses, employing families. And at one time, the New York City government around this time tried to ban the creation of cigars, but to no avail because it was just too big an industry and it was growing too fast. You had the cigar industry moving out from Manhattan to Brooklyn, out on Long Island, and then it returned to New York City. And it became almost a kind of a cottage industry until it became a legitimate one, or a typical one that you see with a typical corporation in the beginning of the 20th century.
It almost feels like what is it, Uber? Right, Uber is this huge industry. Right, it's spreading all over to huge big cities, and a lot of cities, they're kind of almost knee-jerk reaction. Sometimes is to ban it. Right. So that's really what ended up happening. New York became such a hub for manufacture of cigars that it pretty much they needed to add all these regulations onto it.
Right.
So it wouldn't go off on a tangent. Here's the interesting thing. I actually have some numbers here. It is reported that in 1883, cigars were manufactured in 127 apartment houses in New York City, employing almost 2,000 families and almost 8,000 individuals.
Wow.
Yeah. Just not cultivation, just rolling. Because back in the day, there was obviously cigars that you could buy. They had little not vending machines, but little you put a coin, you get a cigar, right? They were usually wrapped in paper or foil, but the majority of cigars were actually hand rolled. You go to a guy, he rolls it, you smoke it, or maybe they were rolled not too long ago. You know what I mean? Usually, that was usually the standard back in the day. I'm talking about, by the way, just want to make it clear, I'm talking about New York.
Right.
I'm not talking about the whole rest of the world because obviously they were producing their asses off. But just in New York, this was the spot for hand rolls. And just knowing that and living in New York City myself is kind of sad.
Why?
Because you can't. It's dead. It's dead. I know maybe of 7 or 8 different establishments that could do that in the whole of not New York City. I'm talking about New York City as in even all 5 boroughs.
You're talking about hand rolling.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it seems like that's a lost art.
Yeah. It was actually a very important part of the city, and I feel like it's kind of lost now. Hopefully it'll make a comeback. I mean, that's honestly my inspiration for starting to roll my own cigars was that I wanted to kind of bring that back. I didn't know any of this, right? I didn't know that New York had such a history with rolling cigars. I just thought that it was so fascinating when I would have people come over and they would, be able to choose the tobaccos and I could blend it for them and roll it for them. That was a lot of fun. I felt like it was something that I couldn't get anywhere in the city, and I wanted to kind of jump into that, because
it's like you're giving them a bespoke experience. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's what makes it so fun. You know what I mean? Because I feel like you can go in, smoke a cigar, you can learn about what's inside of it, but I feel like nothing really beats actually choosing what goes inside a cigar. Now, to be perfectly honest, I tell people like for instance, some people don't realize that a cigar has 3 parts. It has the binder, filler, wrapper, and the filler also needs to have 3 different leaves: a light, a dark, and a medium. I don't know why I said it in that order, but you get what I'm saying.
Right.
So the light leaf is on the outside of the cigar. It helps promote a good burn, and that's pretty much all it does. It doesn't really impart flavor at all. In the center, right, kind of right below the lighter tobacco, you have the medium tobacco, which gives a nice aftertaste and produces a good smokiness. And then on the inside, you have that nice dark oily tobacco, which gives you most of the flavor. Right. But some guys that like to smoke dark cigars, they're like, hey, let me get these 3 fillers in there, and they're all dark fillers, like a Ligero, something really, really oily, and it burns like shit. And they're like, oh, why does this burn like shit? Because you gotta know the steps. You know what I mean? So it's also nice because when people kind of you get to educate them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because let me ask you, Robert, when you go to a place, right? You've visited cigar rollers before, hand rollers?
Once, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did you find it to be like an enthralling experience? Did you have any choice, or how did it go? Did they just roll it and give it to you, right?
Yeah. I mean, I thought it was a kind of a tradition, an old world tradition that they were trying to keep alive. That's becoming more and more rare with each passing day. And, it's a concession to the fact that you can only roll so many cigars So you're going to have to take a hit in your bottom line, but if it's a small mom-and-pop operation, they can afford to do it. I think this was in Florida. I think it was in Key West, Florida, if I remember.
Oh, yeah, we're going to get into that.
We're going to get into
Florida. Florida. Don't even get me started on Florida. Let me just start off our Florida section with this quick little story. So, this gentleman from the Corona Cigar Company, Angel, hits me up. He's their general manager, and he sends me a cigar called the FSG. Excuse me, no. He sent me the FSG, but he also sent me the Army of Angels. And the Army of Angels is actually a cigar that he helped blend himself, and it's about 40 to 50% of the filler is this Florida tobacco, which I've never actually really had. And I smoked this cigar, and I loved it so much. I swear, it tastes like chocolate, earthy. It was smooth. It hit all the points, and plus it was so unique in my perspective. Like, I've never had a tobacco that tasted so chocolatey and had so much coffee notes that I bought a whole box right away. You know what I mean? Because it was so amazing. And then from there, I started doing a little more research, and I found out, Davidoff has a Florida cigar. Drew Estate has a Florida cigar. But then I was very upset to find out that there's really only one farm remaining in Florida that produces cigar-grade tobacco. And I was like, this sucks. Like, you know what I mean? I even tried to get my hands on some of that tobacco so I can incorporate it in my blends, but that didn't really work out. But we'll see. You know, maybe if I go there myself, I could buy a couple of pounds. Anyway, the tobacco even though it is grown in almost the same climate as Cuban tobacco, I think the seed might be different because it does have a much more different taste to it. It is a little more closer to Nicaraguan tobacco, in my opinion, because it does have a certain earthiness that Cuban tobacco tends to lack sometimes. I find Cuban tobacco to be more wood, leather centric, and maybe more nuttiness as an afternote. Of course, peppers. In the Cuban tobaccos, like with the bolivars and all that jazz. But that's what it really did. The Florida tobacco really got me excited. Opa, we got another visitor. Rob, you've won a prize. So that's why when I was researching this episode and I found out the history that Florida had with tobacco, I was again shocked at how... Well, no, not really, right? There's a ton of companies in Florida right now that produce tobacco, let's be honest. But I was just shocked at how big it was back in the day. And I know you know a little bit about this, so why don't you get it started? Well,
this all started in the post-Civil War era when a Spanish cigar manufacturer moved his operations from Havana, Cuba to Key West, Florida, because the 10 Years' War. We had the 7 Years' War before. Now we got the 10 Years' War.
So that was actually Vicente Ebor from he owned the Prince of Wales cigar company. I actually do know about this, but keep it going.
Right, and he moves to Florida, and he moves to a small city near Tampa, Florida, and he ends up building the largest cigar factory in the world at the time. And it's a company town called Ybor City, named after him, obviously.
So what is that real quick, just so we know? What is a company town?
Well, that would be, you have a circumstance where you have a factory or whatever it is that's being produced, and then the owner of the factory would also own land that would have housing where the workers would stay, and also like a general store where the workers would buy products. So it was almost like a monopoly on everything.
Is that still a thing? Do we still have that today in the U.S.?
I would think very rarely. I would think that sort of thing is a vestige of a bygone era, as they say.
You know, when I hear that, when I hear you explain it, I keep thinking of like a company store. Is that what they would have? Is it true that they would pay you in like not U.S. tender? They would give you money that you could only use at their own store. Is that
Scrip.
a thing?
Scrip? You scrip.
What is scrip?
Well, I think of it like monopoly money.
So it's not legal tender. It's more of like a bartering trade.
It's only to be used in their store, so it can be used to purchase products.
Is it something like akin to like a MTA token from back in the day or something?
It's like
is
what they used to pay. The soldiers get paid in scrip so that they don't create a black market.
But it's not like a bond or anything. It's not like connected to anything.
It's like a facsimile of currency.
So it has absolutely zero value outside.
It has zero value in the outside
anywhere.
world, you're right.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So the thing is that excuse me, Vicente Ebor, he started this movement from what I remember, and he pretty much everybody kind of followed him. So he left after the 10-Year War. Then everybody else kind of joined on the bandwagon, joined the movement, and it pretty much turned into Florida into this like cigar haven.
Right.
And you quoted me that number. What was it? How How many cigars did they produce there again?
As a little after the 20th century began, by about 1905, they were producing 80,000 cigar making operations in the entire United States, and the output peaked right after the First World War and in the 1920s when Ybor City and West Tampa rolled over 500 million cigars.
So, that's a lot of cigars. When I heard that number originally, I remember you were telling me about this. When I heard about it, I was thinking to myself, like, how is that even possible? Like, 1900s. What do you think? I know we're just shooting in the air because I definitely don't know. But what do you think was the approximate population of the U.S.? 1/10, 30 million?
No. I would say it was something in the neighborhood, maybe like 140 million.
Really, half?
Yeah.
I would expect it to be more. So I guess 500 million, right? I mean, how many cigars do you smoke a day? I see you take about 2.
Yeah.
When you're feeling particularly adventurous, I see you go for a third one sometimes.
Okay.
I'm actually also doing around 2 or 3. So, do you say you smoke every single day?
Just about.
Just about. So let's do the math real quick. 2 times 7, 14. 14 times 4. What do we got? God, I'm making myself sound like such a dumbass on the radio right now.
14 times 4 is 56.
56. So that's a month, right?
So it's about times 12, 560 plus another 112, 660, 672, rounded off to 700.
So 700 a year. That's
Yeah.
what you're looking at. Yeah, we could have just done the amount of days times 2. I don't know why I did all that math. So let's say, what's your guess? How much of the population smokes cigars? 1 out of 10? No, more. 1 out of 20?
Maybe.
About
yeah.
15 million people, 20 million people, something like that?
Yeah, ballpark.
I don't know. Where do all these cigars go? Do you really think that 500 million cigars were smoked? And that was just Florida.
I know.
That was just one part of Florida.
500 million cigars being produced in Ybor City and West Tampa.
Like, honestly, in the 1900s, I think the population of the whole planet's like 500 million, isn't it?
No, it's probably closer to, it's probably more than that.
Well, yeah, because we already had sort of like medicine. We were keeping people alive, so I guess that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah, but that's fascinating. 80,000. Oh, my God. So
Oopa.
many prizes today. It's unbelievable. So what you mentioned before was really interesting to me. In 1905, there were 80,000 cigar-making operations. So that doesn't mean stores. That doesn't mean, retail shops. That means rollers. Not cultivation either. Just rollers. So that's what I'm saying. I guess back in the day, it was much, 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 much more interesting, much more fascinating thing for people, because nowadays it's so rare. Why do you think that is?
What is it that's rare?
The hand rolling operations. I bet if we looked at the numbers, there's no way there's 80,000 operations in the U.S. anymore. I feel like it was way more back then. Well,
Yeah, I'm assuming that modern, mechanization, modern procedures by which to create tobacco products. I mean, you've all seen them come off the conveyor belt and all that increases volume and decreases the number of actual man hours required to create the product. So like every other product over time, technology and modernization work in favor, hopefully, of the end user.
Actually, you know what? That was a great little segue. I did want to jump into Cuba real quick. Around the 1900s, the period of time we're talking about right now, there was a very drastic change. So I want to give our audience a little explanation between the difference between long filler and short filler. So long filler is cigars that are rolled with whole cigar leaves, bunched up, right? So what happens is that gives you a good flow, a good burn, and the flavor is more consistent and better in this form. And then there's short fillers when you chop up the tobacco leaf, but then you can actually put it into a machine, and the machine can roll the cigar for you. Now, during the Industrial Revolution, when was that, Rob?
Well, we're talking about it hits America in the post-Civil War era.
Yeah, so about...
We're talking after 1865.
1865. So let's say 1900s,
Yeah.
right? It's like early 1900s,
Yeah.
right? They started industrializing the whole cigar making process. So what ended up happening is all these companies, they would instead of going for long filler cigars the old-fashioned way, they would do short filler. They would chop up the tobacco, put it in a machine, click, clack, patty, whack. Literally cuts the time by 10 times, like 1/10 of the time to create the cigar. And the thing is that back in the day, they didn't use molds. So cigars were a bit more lumpier than they are now.
Right.
Like nowadays, they're perfect cylinders, and there are a few rollers that can achieve this kind of form on a cigar without the use of a mold, but it's a very rare skill, and usually there's going to be some deviation in the structure of the cigar when you're not using a mold. So back then, most of these cigars were this like fantastic rustic style. Okay, that's actually the way that I prefer to roll my cigars. I do use molds, but for some reason, having no mold and just using a double binder and just molding the whole thing by hand, just something so fun about it. And you always get something unique. You know what I mean?
And I think I've smoked.
Yes, you have. You've
yeah.
tried some of those.
Yeah.
So now what's happening is the rest of the world is kind of pumping out these cigars. They're short filler, right? So they don't burn as well. They don't have the most consistent of flavors. But what happens is that it's produced faster and cheaper.
Right.
Now Cuba has this problem, right? Because since Cuba is kind of like the holy land of cigars, right? For reasons that we mentioned, pretty much cigar-grade tobacco started in Cuba. Most of the first cigar factory in the New World was in Cuba, right? So all of these things, and they have the perfect climate. So they had a choice to either kind of industrialize or kind of get pushed out, because you have a perfect-looking cigar. With a machine, it always looks perfect.
Right.
It always has it always has perfect structure because it's not made by hands, which we're not perfect. We're human. At the end of the day, Cuba decides, instead of bending to the will of the rest of the world and industrializing their process and turning it into a short filler roll bullshit, whatever, instead of stopping rolling altogether, they create molds. So what is a mold? You take the cigar leaves, you bunch them up, you put them into the mold, right? And then
The mold is usually made out of wood.
It's wood. Nowadays, you can get them in plastic. Nowadays, you can get them 3D printed. It's great. Technology really has gone really, really far. All of my molds... No, excuse me. I'm a liar. So I have 3 molds that are wood, and I have about 6 molds that are made out of plastic, because it doesn't really matter. I mean, the plastic ones are actually lighter. They last longer because the wood tends to warp. The wood tends to absorb some of the oils from the cigar. The plastic does not. So it has its ups and downs. So instead, what the Cubans did is they started using molds. So now they were able to pump out these premium cigars, right, that looked perfect. Obviously, they were a little more time consuming. Obviously, they were a little more expensive, but they were long fillers, so they tasted better. So they pulled better, more consistent. You know what I mean? The tobacco's not chopped up. It has a perfect ash, perfect burn. Pretty much short filler doesn't have any of those properties, and that is pretty much what kept Cuba at the top of the game for so many years afterward, is because they didn't take the easy road out, and they actually decided to stick to their guns. And there's also a fascinating cause and effect here, because many, many, many companies were doing these bullshit short filler cigars. And I feel that if Cuba didn't stand their ground and decided to, not use machines to create the cigars, we would have all been smoking short filler right now. You know what I mean?
Right.
Obviously, I would still be able to talk to you like, hey, Robert, how you doing? This is Dominican tobacco. This is Nicaraguan tobacco. Honduran, the whole same shindig. But it wouldn't be there wouldn't be a thing as premium cigars. You know what I mean? We would all be smoking like Dutch Masters, and to be honest with you, we'd all be happy about it because
Cigarillos.
we wouldn't know any better.
Yeah.
Well, that's funny you mentioned that, because cigarillos are short filler.
Yeah.
All of them are made by machine, so it just doesn't make sense for somebody to sit there and roll a whole bunch of little cigars. Which I get it. Whenever I roll cigarillos, I use my leftover trimmings and shit. So it's all right. But yeah, is there anything you want to add there on that point?
It's really quite remarkable. Again, we keep going back to that one figure about the 500 million Havana cigars. It's just...
I think they called it Clear Havana because it was from Florida.
Yeah, and it's how Ybor City got to be known as the cigar capital of the world, and we can see why, because they could really turn out the product like nobody's business.
Well, even though I wouldn't say that, Florida is definitely still the center of U.S. tobacco manufacturing for sure. I mean, obviously, the majority of the operations are overseas, but most of the good stuff happens in Florida. Like, God, I don't want to make a mistake right now, but I think Padron makes their stuff down there. It's obviously all Nicaraguan Puro. By the way, that is my favorite Nicaraguan Puro cigar. You know what? We have about 10 minutes left. What do you think? I think, you know what? So I think we should actually delve a little bit, just a teeny little bit, because I know the people want to know. We're boring them with all this pre-1920s. We're getting slowly and slowly and slowly more closer to everyone's favorite topic when it comes to cigars, at least here in the U.S. And you know what that is?
Tell me.
The embargo.
Well, of course, the embargo comes about in 1962, I believe. President Kennedy signs an executive order creating that embargo. That he did that, by the way. The story goes supposedly just before he got his aides to get him several boxes of Cuban cigars. Then he signed the order.
I didn't hear it was several. I heard it was like couple of thousand.
Well, maybe the story's become apocryphal. I don't know, but that's the whole idea. But we got to the point of the embargo because of course, the Cold War and the wake of World War II, when, curiously enough, cigarettes were never more popular. You had athletes, you had movie stars appearing.
Women.
Yes, women.
Like, I remember the cigarette companies were saying things like, hey, pal, excuse me, hey, gal, want to have a smaller baby? Just smoke cigarettes.
Right.
Every woman loves cigarettes when they're pregnant. Smaller kids.
Right. So modern communications technologies were being used to get everybody and his mother to smoke.
Yeah.
And sure enough, that's what was happening.
Yeah, they did a great job.
And so after the Second World War is over, the Cold War ensues, and it's East against West, and it's the United States and its satellites against Russia. And, of course, Russia's satellite, one of its satellites was Cuba. And
both communist, I believe.
Yes.
Right? Is that what the connection was?
Yes. And so the then president of the United States at the time decides that he's going to try and inflict some degree of damage on the Cuban economy by dictating that there will be an embargo preventing any of its products to be sold in the United States.
But what was the exact impetus, though? Wasn't it missiles? What was it?
Well, I think you're conflating this with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which happened in October '62, which you'll recall was when the Khrushchev regime in Russia wanted to place, and in fact did place, offensive nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba, pointed just 90 miles away from the mainland of the United States.
But how did that work? Was it first missile crisis, then embargo?
I believe the embargo preceded it.
Oh, so what was the impetus against the embargo then? I thought it was the missiles. Maybe I'm wrong, but
the purpose of the embargo was to prevent Cuban products from being sold in the United States because it's the largest market in the world, thereby inflicting harm in their economy, which I guess in theory meant hopefully that it would cause the regime in Cuba to fall apart, and maybe there'd be a revolution, and maybe a government that would be more solicitous of the United States and of the West would come to the fore.
And to be honest with you, like Cuba, funny enough, I feel is like a good example of why this shit doesn't really work, right? Because the regime never changed. There was no, like when was there really any change when it comes to the embargo in the U.S.? I find it was like during the Obama era. Is that right?
Well, probably the greatest impact to them was when the Soviet Union fell apart and they weren't able to get oil and other important products from the Soviet Union.
See, so for me, right? For me personally, so I was born in 1990.
Right.
1 year later, the Soviet Union collapses,
implodes.
but I wasn't like aware of that. So pretty much, what happened is, I remember when Obama was president, right? Because I live here in New York, right next to JFK. I remember we had JFK Havana. You know what I mean? So to me personally, I thought that that was a huge sign that it was getting better. You know what I mean? But I get it. I guess your Big Daddy Soviet Union falling apart and was probably the biggest issue that they had to face at the time. But you know what? I think that's just about where we'll leave it. Really quickly though, I did want to bring up two more. I guess one more interesting thing that I read about recently. So did you hear about the royal courtesan?
The royal courtesan.
Yeah, courtesan.
Yeah.
Courtesian?
Courtesan.
Courtesan. Do you know about this? Did I tell you about this?
No. Is this something recently in the news? Or?
No, it wasn't really in the news. It was this company Gurkha. So I did as much research as I could about this to try to figure out if this was a joke or not, and I couldn't really figure it out. But what it said is that they actually produced the first $1 million cigar.
Ah. I think I did hear about this.
You know about this? So let me give you a little background. This is pretty much what I heard, okay? So it's tobacco, and okay, don't quote me on this, okay, because I'm not 100,000% sure about the details, even though I did research as much as possible. There's just alarm bells going off in my head that this is a prank. Okay, so here's what happened. Cigar is grown in the Himalayas, okay? It's grown using water imported from Mount Fiji, all right? So I don't really know how that works. Apparently, they import water from a mountain to another mountain to water some sort of tobacco. No mention of what kind of tobacco it is, but I bet you it's something just as wild as what the first thing is, importing freaking water to the Himalayas. Anyway, next, the tobacco is apparently aged for a ludicrously long amount of time. On top of that, they get the best rollers in the world to roll the cigars, and they don't use their eyes. They're blindfolded. So apparently they can only kind of use their sense of touch to guide their senses when it comes to their cigar rolling. And apparently, I don't know. I never tried it. I don't know if rolling blind will make you a better roller. Maybe there's something to it. I should try it probably. But
I'll stand behind you with my hands over your eyes.
Yeah, okay, that's freaking weird. But anyway. So, and then, right, this is where it gets even more interesting. Every single cigar is infused with, what was it, Louis the 13th Black Pearl. All right? How much do you think a bottle of that goes for?
I haven't the faintest idea.
All right, shoot me a number.
$100 an ounce.
I don't know about that. Give me a number for a whole bottle.
$10,000.
Up.
$50,000.
Up.
$1 million.
Okay, down. If the cigar's $1 million.
$500,000.
All right, $125,000 a bottle.
Oy.
So each cigar is infused with a whole bottle.
Wow.
Okay? Then, we're not done. Then it has about 250 leaves of gold on it. Okay? Right? And you think that's the end of it? It's not. Then it has a band which has a untold amount of carats in it. The thing looks like a diamond ring of a freaking celebrity marriage. You know what I mean? And you think that's it, but there's more.
There's more, folks.
There's more, folks. Each cigar that you purchase gets you white glove service. You know what that is?
Somebody comes along and cuts it, lights it.
Yes, in these like silky white gloves, but they come in a Rolls Royce.
Of course.
And on a private jet.
Of course.
Just to bring you the cigar.
They're not coming on the subway.
I don't know. What do you think? Do you think this is? You think it's real?
I think it's actually real. I think it's actually real, and it's probably geared to that very, very, very high-end customer at the very tippy top.
I haven't heard of anybody actually using it, but I was just fascinated by the story. It's something that I was thinking about like sharing with. Oh, yeah.
I understand Jeff Bezos gave his wife a box.
Dude,
good night,
Jeff
New York.
Bezos can afford to give her what, $45 billion. So that's 4,500 of those bad boys. Can you imagine?
Yeah. Something tells me she took Amazon stock.
That's right. All right, folks. Thank you so much for tuning in. City World Radio. Again, I'm Artie the Cigar Guy. Thank you so much, Robert, for coming with me and discussing the history of tobacco. I had a great time. How about you?
It's been my pleasure.
Would you come back?
Absolutely.
Oh, hell yeah, but I'm not going to invite you. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding, man. We'll see how it goes. All right.
I love cigars. Blah, blah, blah.